Hello and welcome to Disastrous History. Today's video is going to be an interesting one because this is one of my rabbit holes that I like to go down usually once a year. If you are looking at the screen right now, it says Idaho Stadium unsafe for use. That's because we're going to talk about one of my probably it's considered a conspiracy theory of back in 1969 and 1970, the University of Idaho and Washington State University had their stadiums burned down because they didn't like them. So we're going to jump into this real quick. Now, before we get too far into this, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on this. So, number one, I used to be a fire investigator. So this is right in my wheelhouse. I did fire investigations for 7 years. I did several hundred fire investigations. So this is right in my wheelhouse. And I'm also obsessed with college football. If you've watched any of my other videos, I'm generally always wearing a college shirt of some location. I have not been to all of those colleges. I just like to collect them. Usually some that are related to my friends. Like I have friends that went to TCU and are big TCU fans. So that's that. Anyway, getting into this, there were two fires back in 1969 and then 1970 that happened at college stadiums approximately. Oh, let's go ahead and just pull this up real quick because I don't know off the top of my head how far apart Pullman and Moscow. So if you don't know, Washington State University and University of Idaho in Moscow, it's pronounced Moscow. If you don't pronounce it Moscow, they will yell at you, are only 7 miles apart. That is not very far in the grand scheme of things. Now, they are obviously across the border from each other, but they are very close. And back in the late 60s and early 70s, well, mid 60s to late 60s, they played each other a lot. And Idaho Stadium, at the time called Neal Stadium, was very run down. It was actually condemned prior to this fire. It was actually condemned prior to the end of the 1969 season for soil erosion from under the stands, and it was unstable, and it generally just wasn't a great stadium. And because of this particular condemnation, the Idaho Vandals were going to play their home games at nearby Rogers Field while the new stadium was being built. This is what the old stadium looked like. Here, let me move myself out of the way a little bit. There you go. This is what the old stadium, this is what Neal Stadium looked like pre-fire. There are no pictures of it post-fire, but this is what it looked like pre-fire. And on the night of the fire, it was discovered at 11:55 p.m. Up in... Here, let me go back to the picture here. It was discovered up here in the press box on this right side right here. And the fire department was called. They got there. They got the fire under control within 50 minutes. It was pretty much only contained to this particular area right here. Now, in the aftermath of this particular fire, the fire chief and... So the fire chief, Moscow Fire Chief Ralph E. McAllister, stated the blaze was apparently started by arson. There was no reason other than that for a fire to start in the old wooden structure. Now, if you are performing proper fire investigation protocol, that is not a good enough reason to determine it to be arson. So that is what you call negative corpus. Essentially, you have eliminated everything else, so it has to be this one thing that you haven't eliminated, and you cannot perform an investigation that way. It simply doesn't work like that. Now, we are not doing a fire investigation, and so we are going to go ahead and run with the idea of fire investigation. Now, or arson, I'm sorry. Now, there are multiple theories for what this particular fire could have been. It was a condemned old wooden structure, so it is not well maintained in the first place, and it was also well known that the structure was not well maintained and was essentially abandoned. They hadn't played any games in it that season, so one potential there is this is a college. this is a college in the late 60s, so it's very likely that some college students had, broken into the grandstands and, I don't know, were up there smoking, dropped a cigarette, whatever, walked away, fire sat there and smoldered, and then that's how it was going. There's also the potential that someone broke into it and was sleeping there and had set a fire. It was the middle of November. It was November 23rd, 1969. So someone broke in. It's a cold, chilly night. They set a fire. Fire gets out of hand. They can't really do anything about it. It was called in by an unidentified person to the fire station at 11:55. Potential for if someone was in there sleeping, set a fire, left, and then called 911 or called the fire department as soon as they got out of the area. That's not unheard of, to be honest. When the call was received, flames were visible from downtown Moscow, which is a decent distance. It's not terrible. It is also the middle of the night, so any decent-sized fire is going to light up a lot of the area. But they were able to get it out pretty quickly. Now, I do want to highlight that the arson investigator from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho's name was Thor Fladwed, which is an absolutely amazing name. He also said that it seemed to indicate that it was arson. Now, when I originally did the research, 2018, I believe. This was an actual article. Unfortunately, that article seems to have been deleted from the University of Idaho's website. So at the bottom of this particular article, there was a bunch of interviews with the students around it, and one of the students said that it was that it was all a communist plot. But conveniently, they were having issues. Idaho was having issues prior to this, getting the approval to tear down the stadium and build the new stadium. They weren't convinced, the school wasn't convinced that a new stadium was the thing for Idaho. And so they had the fire, it rallied the school around it. They then began to build what is arguably the best stadium in college football now, the Kibbe Dome. Now, if you aren't obsessed with college football, you don't know what the Kibbe Dome is, but it's massively entertaining. And if you played a lot of college football video games, NCAA 14, the Kibbe Dome was everyone's favorite. So unfortunately, there are no pictures of Neal Stadium post-fire, like I said earlier, so we can't really look at fire damage. But what I can tell you is that basically every newspaper article says that it burned on the south side of the stadium, basically between the 40-yard lines, and it completely consumed most of the press box, which collapsed down into the stands and then burned from there and was able to be contained by the fire department. The good news for Idaho was they had already agreed to lease out Washington State's Rogers Field for home football games in 1970. The problem then became that in April of 1970, Rogers Field also caught on fire, suspiciously on the south side at the press box, which then collapsed down into the stands and burned from there. Now, the actual mechanism of it collapsing down makes sense. It's heavy, it's going to burn, the structural members are eventually going to fail, causing it to collapse down. The interesting part of this is there's not really anything going on in April for college football. Like, there's going to be practices, most likely, but they're not going to be anyone up in the press grandstands. The other thing was, this fire happened on a Saturday at 10 p.m. The fire was under control by 2 a.m., but witnesses who saw the start of the fire stated that there was a suspicious individual driving away in a Mercury at a high rate of speed away from the fire as it was burning. Now, once you read enough about fires, you realize that witnesses to the start of fires think that every car driving by is suspicious. Every single one. Literally, every single fire, someone will find something suspicious about it. However, it's interesting in this case because Washington State Fire Marshal J.E. Sykes stated that this was also incendiary. They had no other explanation for this, which again, you're not technically supposed to do, but we're going to go with it. Now, we can understand why Idaho would want their stadium to burn down. They wanted a new stadium. Theirs was condemned. It made it significantly easier to tear it down because if it's burnt and it collapses, it's a lot easier than having to carefully bring it down so it doesn't fall on anyone else. Like, that makes sense. But Washington State had a decently good stadium. What is the reasoning for, them wanting to burn down their own stadium? Well, the answer to that question is Washington State was in the Pac-10 at the time, which had some big schools such as USC, University of Southern California, UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and Stanford. And the Pac-10 teams are some of college football royalty, especially USC. At that time, USC was pretty good at football. And having to travel out to Pullman for a conference game was embarrassing for Washington State because their stadium was really small. Like, USC has the Rose Bowl and UCLA has the LA Coliseum. Those are the cathedrals of college football, if you will. And while Rogers Field was fine, it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't the thing that you would expect from a big team in a big conference, because at that time, the Pac-10 was a big deal conference. So they had wanted a new stadium for a while, and maybe they just so happened to get an idea from the school down the road that was currently leasing their stadium that said, hey, we just did this and we're getting a new stadium faster than we expected. What if you guys did the same thing? Now, is it possible? Maybe. There are a lot of rumors in actual Pullman to this day that the stadium was purposely burnt down by the school itself so that they could get a new stadium, so that they could be more impressive during conference games and they wouldn't get kicked out of the conference, which, I mean, technically, they didn't get kicked out of the conference eventually. The conference just left them because, USC and UCLA are now in the Big Ten, and Stanford and Cal are now in the ACC. So, eventually the conference left them, despite them, probably burning down their own stadium. Now, there were a bunch of protests on campus because this was the late 60s and early 70s. So there was the usual, this was communists. This was, hippies. This was whoever. But I got to tell you, I have been around college sports a lot in my life, and I have seen and heard some wild things that have actually happened in college programs. And burning down your stadium to get a new one, especially in the 60s and 70s, is not that far-fetched at all. At all. So these are two fires within 5 months of each other with the same type of damage in the same area around the same time of night with the same conclusion from two different investigators in two different states with essentially no other possible conclusion. Now, we have the potential of, college students going up there and partying, but I mean, I was in college. I did every once in a while go into my college football stadium and, but I never really went up in the press box because once you're off of the field, it becomes a little bit more obvious and you're a little bit more likely to get in more trouble if you get caught. It's also a theory that it could be some random disgruntled student, but that doesn't seem to fit because, why the football stadium? Washington State and University of Idaho are not big football schools. This isn't like targeting the Rose Bowl would make sense. Targeting the LA Coliseum would make sense. Those are big symbols of those particular schools. These are not big symbols of these particular schools. And when you're trying to make a statement against something, you go for their big symbol. Neither one of these are their big symbol. The other thing is that there is another stadium, Joe Albee Stadium, which ended up hosting both University of Idaho and Washington State for the 1970 and 1971 seasons while the two respective stadiums were being built. And prior to these two fires, Joe Walby Stadium was essentially only hosting high school football games. They used to have all of they'd have the occasional college game, but that pretty much stopped, and it was essentially only high school games. Now, do I think that representatives of Joe Walby Stadium were like, you know what we should do? Burn down both stadiums? That seems more of a stretch than someone in the schools being like, yeah, we should burn our stadium down so that we can get our new stadium faster. Because everybody knows that college football is the big moneymaker, especially in athletics for college. Like, there are some profitable college basketball teams, but it is college football that is the moneymaker. It has always been the moneymaker because they have the big stadiums that have all of those seats. So getting rid of your small stadiums to build a bigger, more modern, newer, better stadium, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, why wouldn't we? And like, Idaho wasn't paying Washington State all that much to lease it for 3 games because they would have had to split some of the ticket share with Idaho. Idaho would probably give them a flat fee, and then Idaho would get all of the proceeds from the tickets because it's a 9-mile drive. So it's not like, Idaho's fans have to go all that far to go to a football game. So kind of seems like maybe Washington State and Idaho, pulled this all together themselves. Now, this particular photo is actually a photo of Rogers Field burning. And one of the things that comes up as interesting is that there are some rumors that while and after Rogers Field was burning, the head coach of Washington State at the time, Jim Sweeney, was overjoyed by the fact that the old aging stadium was on fire and was very excited that it meant that there would be a new stadium built. So there were a lot of people that were suspected of setting this fire. Football players, old, angry former employees, a stadium employee that acted weird, the usual stuff in the aftermath of a fire. But it was never conclusively proven who set Rogers Field on fire. It was also never conclusively proven who set Neal Stadium on fire. Neal Stadium was barely investigated at all because it was already a condemned stadium, so who really cares, to be honest? It was going to be torn down anyway. That fire just made it significantly easier and faster. However, Rogers Field was another story because while it was not slated to be torn down, it was also not popular. Washington State had played many of their home games away from their actual field because it just didn't seat enough people, which is embarrassing, again, for a team that is playing against the likes of USC and UCLA and places like that. So I don't know. I'm pretty convinced that officials at both of these fields, and I say officials more like someone in the athletics department, said, hey, other person, go deal with this problem stadium that we have so we can get a new one at both schools. I think that the University of Idaho one feels a little bit less egregious, but I think that the Rogers Field one feels like they saw what happened at Idaho and said, we can do that too, the exact same way. And conveniently, the day that it happened, April 4th, 1970, was the first day of spring break. So there were almost no students on campus. Almost. There were still a couple, but it was pretty much empty. So not going to be that many witnesses around as well to, say, hey, what are you doing? Why is there someone up in the stadium? And as the fire started, there were multiple explosions heard. Now, in fires, many people report hearing explosions. In fires that don't have any explosions whatsoever, it's one of those things where people confuse the sound of things collapsing and things falling apart and all of that for an actual explosion. But who knows? Maybe this one was an incendiary bomb of some sort. Don't know. but it does sit there in my brain, and I think about it all the time about how I'm 100% convinced that individuals at University of Idaho and Washington State either colluded together to be like, hey, we can get rid of these stadiums and get brand new ones, or Idaho had theirs and then Washington State said, we could probably do the same thing. So with that, we'll reach the end of it. I appreciate you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, stay safe. Remember to check your smoke detector batteries.